The November wind cut through Sarah's thin jacket like a blade, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain and the distant aroma of coffee from the diner across the street. She pulled her knees closer to her chest as she sat on the cold concrete steps of St. Mary's Presbyterian Church, watching the early morning commuters hurry past without so much as a glance in her direction. 3 days had passed since she'd first claimed this small patch of sanctuary, and each night had been colder than the last. Sarah hadn't planned on becoming homeless. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a nurse at Sacred Heart Hospital, living in a modest apartment on Maple Street, believing that hard work and dedication were enough to keep life stable. The eviction notice had arrived on a Tuesday morning, stamped with red ink that seemed to bleed across the white paper like a wound. Medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment had drained her savings faster than water through a broken dam. Even with her nursing salary, the mounting debt had become insurmountable. The hospital had laid her off the same week her mother passed away. Budget cuts, they'd said, though Sarah suspected her frequent absences during her mother's final weeks hadn't helped her case. The timing felt cruel, as if the universe had decided to strip away everything that mattered in one devastating sweep. Her mother's funeral had cost the last of her emergency fund, leaving her with enough money for either rent or groceries, but not both. Now, as she watched a businessman check his expensive watch while waiting for the crosswalk signal, Sarah wondered if she'd become invisible. People walked past her small form huddled on the church steps as if she were part of the architecture, just another shadow cast by the building's Gothic spires. She tried the homeless shelter twice, but both times the overcrowded facility had turned her away. The women's section was full, they'd explained with apologetic shrugs, suggesting she try again the following night. The church steps had become her refuge by default rather than choice. During the day, when services weren't being held, the broad stone platform offered a place to sit and think. At night, the overhang protected her from direct rainfall, though it did little to block the wind that seemed determined to find every gap in her clothing. She'd fashioned a makeshift bed from cardboard she'd found behind a nearby grocery store, layering it with newspapers and the few spare clothes she'd managed to salvage from her apartment. Father Martinez, the elderly priest who served the congregation, had noticed her on the second day. He'd emerged from the church's heavy wooden doors, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread. His approach had been gentle, his voice carrying the soft accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language later in life. "Good morning," he'd said, settling beside her on the steps with a careful grace that spoke of arthritic joints and decades of practice at meeting people where they were. "I thought you might be cold." Sarah had accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic mug as if it were a lifeline. The warmth had spread through her palms and up her arms, bringing feeling back to fingertips that had grown numb during the night. The bag contained a ham sandwich, an apple, and a small container of soup that was still warm from the church kitchen. "Thank you," she'd whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse and the cold air she'd been breathing for days. "I can move somewhere else if I'm causing problems." Father Martinez had shaken his head slowly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "These steps have seen many people over the years," he'd said. "Some seeking shelter, others seeking answers. The church was built to be a sanctuary, and that includes the steps as much as the sanctuary inside." He'd stayed with her for nearly an hour that first morning, sharing stories about the neighborhood and its history while she ate. The area had once been home to a thriving community of immigrants. He'd explained, families who'd built lives from nothing and supported each other through economic hardships and social challenges. Many of the older buildings still bore traces of that heritage in the architectural details and the family businesses that had been passed down through generations. Community, he'd said, watching a group of schoolchildren walk past on their way to the elementary school 2 blocks over, is something that must be cultivated intentionally. It doesn't just happen because people live in the same area. Sarah had nodded, though at the time she'd felt disconnected from any sense of community. Her relationships had been casualties of the financial stress and emotional exhaustion that had preceded her mother's death. Friends had initially offered sympathy and support, but as the weeks turned into months and her situation worsened rather than improved, their calls had become less frequent. She understood their discomfort. Her problems had become too big and too persistent for casual friendship to address. The nights were the hardest part. During the day, she could maintain the fiction that her situation was temporary, just a brief setback before returning to normal life. She'd walk to the public library and spend hours researching job opportunities, filling out applications on their computers, and reading to pass the time. The librarians had grown accustomed to her presence and seemed to understand her circumstances without requiring explanation. But when darkness fell and the streets emptied of foot traffic, the reality of her situation became inescapable. She was alone in a way that went beyond physical solitude. The sounds of the city at night, distant sirens, the rumble of late buses, the occasional shout from revelers leaving the bars downtown, only emphasized her isolation. She'd lie on her cardboard bed, staring up at the church's stone arches, wondering how her life had unraveled so completely. On her third morning, she'd awakened to find that someone had left a sleeping bag beside the church doors during the night. It was old but clean, the kind used for camping, with a flannel lining that promised warmth she hadn't experienced in days. No note accompanied the gift, no explanation or identification of the giver. Father Martinez had emerged shortly after sunrise to find her examining the sleeping bag with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected kindness. "It appears someone wanted you to be more comfortable," he'd observed, offering his usual morning coffee and breakfast. "There are good people in this neighborhood, though they don't always announce their presence." The sleeping bag had transformed her nights from exercises in endurance into something approaching rest. She'd been able to sleep for longer periods, waking less frequently from the cold, and had noticed her thinking becoming clearer during the day. The simple gift had felt like a message that she wasn't as invisible as she believed. Father Martinez had continued his morning visits, bringing food and conversation with the consistency of someone who understood that routine could provide stability even in unstable circumstances. He told her about the church's history, how it had been built by immigrant families in the early 1900s who'd pooled their resources to create a place of worship that reflected their values and traditions. The building had survived economic depressions, 2 wars, and numerous social changes, serving as a constant in a neighborhood that had seen waves of different populations settle and move on. "Buildings can be more than just structures," he'd said on the third morning, watching as she carefully folded the sleeping bag and tucked it behind one of the stone pillars where it wouldn't be immediately visible to passersby. "They can hold memory and intention, becoming repositories for the hopes and struggles of the people who've passed through them." Sarah had begun to understand what he meant. The church steps had started to feel less like a place where she was temporarily stranded and more like a location with its own significance. She'd noticed details about the stonework that she'd missed initially, intricate carvings that suggested the original builders had intended the structure to last for generations. The steps themselves were worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, creating subtle depressions that seemed to have been shaped specifically for sitting. The businessman who checked his watch each morning had begun to nod in her direction, a small acknowledgement of her presence that felt like progress. The school children who passed on their way to classes sometimes offered shy smiles, though they seemed to understand instinctively not to stare. Even the crossing guard at the nearby intersection had started including her in his general survey of the street, making eye contact when she looked in his direction. These small interactions had begun to restore Sarah's sense of being part of the world rather than simply observing it from the margins. She'd realized how much of her identity had been tied to her role as a nurse, to being someone who helped others and contributed to society. Without that professional identity, she felt not just unemployed, but somehow fundamentally diminished. The acknowledgement from strangers, however minimal, reminded her that her worth as a person existed independent of her job status or living situation. On the afternoon of her third day, while sitting on the steps and reading a book she'd borrowed from the library, Sarah had noticed an elderly Native American man walking slowly down the sidewalk. His pace was deliberate rather than hurried, and he seemed to be observing the neighborhood with the attention of someone who saw details that others might miss. His long gray hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and he wore a simple flannel shirt and well-worn jeans that suggested practical priorities over fashion. The man had paused at the corner near the church, not as if he were lost or waiting for traffic, but as if he were taking time to absorb something about the place. Sarah had watched him from her position on the steps, curious about what had caught his attention. When he turned in her direction, their eyes had met briefly before she'd looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. He'd continued walking, disappearing around the corner toward the residential area that extended north of the church. But something about the encounter had stayed with Sarah throughout the afternoon. There had been a quality to his presence that felt different from the hurried energy of most people she observed on the street. He'd moved through the space as if he belonged there, not in the sense of ownership, but in the deeper way of someone who understood his place in the larger pattern of things. That evening, as she prepared for another night on the steps, arranging the sleeping bag and positioning her small backpack as a pillow, Sarah had found herself thinking about belonging. Before her mother's illness, she'd taken for granted the various ways she'd been connected to the community around her. Her job at the hospital, her apartment lease, her relationships with colleagues and neighbors, all of these had provided a sense of place and purpose that she'd only recognized in their absence. The process of becoming homeless hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been a gradual erosion of the structures that had anchored her life, each loss making the next one more likely. First, the mounting medical bills had strained her budget. Then, her mother's declining health had required increasing amounts of time away from work. The combination of financial stress and emotional exhaustion had made it difficult to maintain relationships or seek help before the situation became critical. Now, lying in the sleeping bag on the church steps, Sarah had begun to wonder if belonging was something that could be rebuilt from nothing, or if it required the kind of institutional connections she no longer possessed. The kindness of Father Martinez and the anonymous gift of the sleeping bag suggested that community could exist in forms she hadn't previously recognized. But she still felt fundamentally displaced, as if she were occupying space that wasn't really meant for her. The night sounds of the city had become familiar over her 3 days on the steps. The last bus of the evening passed at 10:30, its diesel engine laboring as it climbed the hill toward the residential neighborhoods. The streetlights created pools of yellow illumination that left deep shadows between them, and Sarah had learned to position herself where she could see anyone approaching while remaining relatively hidden from casual observation. Around midnight, she'd heard footsteps approaching from the direction where she'd seen the elderly Native American man walking earlier. The steps were unhurried, but purposeful, and they stopped near the base of the church steps. Sarah had frozen in her sleeping bag, trying to determine if she should acknowledge the presence of whoever was standing nearby or pretend to be asleep. "Cold night," a gentle voice had said, speaking into the darkness without seeming to expect an immediate response. "Winter's coming early this year." Sarah had recognized the voice as belonging to the man she'd seen that afternoon. She'd remained still for a moment, uncertain about how to respond. Her experiences over the past 3 days had made her wary of nighttime encounters, though nothing in the man's tone had suggested threat or aggression. "Yes," she'd finally whispered, her voice barely audible in the night air. "It's getting colder each day." The man had responded, a sound that seemed to acknowledge both her words and her wariness. Sometimes the cold helps us understand what warmth really means. He'd remained standing at the base of the steps for several minutes, not speaking, but not leaving either. His presence had felt companionable rather than intrusive, as if he were simply sharing the space rather than claiming it. Eventually, Sarah had heard his footsteps resume, moving away in the same unhurried pace with which he'd arrived. The brief encounter had left her with a sense of curiosity rather than anxiety. There had been something in the man's voice that suggested understanding, as if he recognized her situation without requiring explanation. His comment about the cold had felt like observation rather than judgment, acknowledging the reality of her circumstances without offering the kind of advice or sympathy that often made her feel more isolated rather than less. As she drifted towards sleep that third night, Sarah had found herself wondering about the man's story. His age and appearance suggested someone who'd experienced significant portions of life, and his calm presence in the darkness indicated a comfort with solitude that came from practice rather than circumstance. She'd sensed in him a quality she'd been missing in her own life, a sense of belonging that didn't depend on external validation or conventional markers of success. The morning of her 4th day on the church steps dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to penetrate every layer of clothing. Sarah had awakened to find the sleeping bag damp despite the overhang, and she'd spent the early hours trying to dry it against the stone walls of the church while avoiding the worst of the rain. Father Martinez had arrived earlier than usual, carrying not just coffee and food, but also a thermos of hot soup and a weather radio. "The forecast calls for heavier rain this afternoon," he'd said, settling beside her under the limited protection of the overhang. I wanted to make sure you had something warm to sustain you through the day. They'd sat together in comfortable silence, watching the rain darken the empty street and listening to the weather reports predict a storm system that would bring more significant precipitation by evening. Sarah had felt grateful for the priest's consistent kindness, though she'd also begun to worry about what would happen if the weather made the church steps uninhabitable. Father Martinez, she'd said eventually, working up the courage to ask the question that had been forming in her mind. Are there other places people go when the weather gets too bad for the streets? The priest had considered her question carefully, his expression suggesting that he understood the broader implications of what she was asking. There are some possibilities, he'd said slowly. The shelter system is overwhelmed, as you've discovered, but there are informal networks of people who help each other during difficult times. Sometimes community exists in ways that aren't immediately visible to those who need it most. His words had reminded Sarah of her encounter with the elderly Native American man the night before. There had been something in that brief exchange that suggested the existence of connections she didn't yet understand, networks of care and support that operated outside the formal system she'd tried to access. As the morning progressed and the rain intensified, Sarah had found herself thinking about the nature of community and belonging. Her professional life as a nurse had been built around formal structures and institutional relationships, but her current circumstances had stripped away access to those systems. The kindness she'd experienced from Father Martinez and the anonymous gift of a sleeping bag had come from sources that operated by different rules, based on recognition of shared humanity rather than official credentials or eligibility requirements. The rain arrived in earnest that afternoon, transforming from a gentle drizzle into a steady downpour that sent most people scurrying for indoor shelter. Sarah had retreated as far back under the church overhang as possible, but the wind-driven rain still managed to find her, soaking through her jacket and making the stone steps slippery and treacherous. She'd wrapped the sleeping bag around her shoulders like a cloak, though its effectiveness was diminishing as moisture seeped through the outer fabric. By 4 o'clock, the temperature had dropped noticeably, and Sarah could see her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Her fingers had grown numb despite her efforts to keep them warm, and she'd begun to worry seriously about spending another night exposed to the elements. The church building itself was locked during non-service hours, and while Father Martinez had shown her consistent kindness, she hadn't felt comfortable asking him to bend the rules about allowing people inside overnight. She was contemplating her options when she noticed the same elderly Native American man from the previous evening walking down the street, seemingly unbothered by the rain. He moved with the same deliberate pace she'd observed before, though he'd added a worn leather jacket over his flannel shirt as a concession to the weather. His gray hair was now braided down his back, and water dripped steadily from the brim of a simple baseball cap. As he approached the church, he looked directly at Sarah huddled under the overhang. This time, instead of continuing past, he climbed the steps slowly and settled himself on the stone ledge beside where she was sitting. The move was made without asking permission or offering explanation, as natural as if he'd been planning to meet her there all along. Rough weather for sleeping outside, he said, pulling a thermos from inside his jacket and unscrewing the cap. Steam rose from the opening, carrying the rich aroma of coffee mixed with something else, perhaps cinnamon or cardamom. He poured the liquid into the cap, which doubled as a small cup, and offered it to Sarah without ceremony. Sarah accepted the warm cup gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around it and breathing in the aromatic steam before taking a careful sip. The coffee was strong and sweet, with a complexity of flavors that suggested it had been prepared with care and attention. The warmth spread through her chest and seemed to reach all the way to her fingertips, providing relief she hadn't realized how desperately she needed. "Thank you," she said, looking at the man who'd appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. "I'm Sarah." "Joseph," he replied, pouring coffee for himself in a small metal cup he'd produced from his other pocket. "Joseph Crow Feather. I live about 6 blocks from here, over on Elmwood." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, sharing the shelter of the overhang while the rain continued to fall steadily around them. Sarah found herself studying Joseph's face, noting the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors and the quiet dignity with which he occupied space. There was something about his presence that felt calming, as if his mere proximity provided a kind of stability she'd been missing. "Been sleeping here long?" Joseph asked eventually, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. It wasn't the pointed curiosity of someone looking for gossip, but the gentle inquiry of someone who understood that stories needed to be told at their own pace. 3 nights, Sarah replied, then found herself adding, though it feels much longer. Everything changed so quickly that I'm still trying to understand how I ended up here. Joseph nodded slowly, as if her words had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Change has a way of happening faster than we can prepare for it, he said. Like a river changing course after a spring flood. One day, the water's flowing in a direction you've known all your life, and the next day, it's carving out completely new channels. The metaphor resonated with Sarah in a way that more conventional expressions of sympathy had not. It captured both the suddenness of her circumstances and the sense that her life had been permanently altered rather than temporarily disrupted. The image of water finding new channels also suggested possibility. The idea that change, even devastating change, might lead to something different rather than simply to loss. I was a nurse, she said, surprised to hear herself sharing personal information with someone she'd just met. At Sacred Heart Hospital, I thought that gave me some security, some protection against ending up in a situation like this. Medical people, Joseph said thoughtfully, always trying to heal others, sometimes forget they need healing too. His observation touched something raw in Sarah's chest. Throughout her mother's illness and her own financial crisis, she'd continued to function in her professional role as a caregiver, supporting patients and families through their medical emergencies while her own life unraveled. The habit of putting others' needs first had become so ingrained that she'd struggled to recognize her own distress until it was too late to address it effectively. My mother died 6 weeks ago, she continued, the words coming more easily than they had in previous attempts to explain her situation. Cancer. The treatment costs were more than our insurance covered, and I'd used all my savings trying to help her. When the hospital laid me off the same week she passed away, I couldn't afford rent anymore. Joseph received her story with the kind of quiet attention that suggested he understood the weight of what she was sharing. He didn't offer immediate advice or reassurance, didn't try to minimize her experience or suggest easy solutions. Instead, he simply listened, creating space for her words in a way that people who've experienced significant loss learn to do for others. Grief and poverty, he said after a long moment. Difficult companions. They feed each other, make everything harder to bear. The rain had begun to lighten, though the sky remained gray and threatening. Sarah found herself feeling more comfortable with Joseph than she had with anyone since her mother's death. There was something about his presence that didn't require her to perform optimism or gratitude, didn't demand that she pretend her situation was temporary or manageable. The shelter's been full every time I've tried, she said. I keep thinking I'll find a job, get back on my feet, but it's hard to look employable when you're living on church steps. And it's hard to think clearly when you're cold and worried about where you'll sleep. Survival takes a lot of energy, Joseph agreed. Doesn't leave much left over for planning or hoping. He paused, seeming to consider something carefully before speaking again. There are other options besides the shelter. Informal networks, people who help each other without going through official channels. Sarah looked at him with new attention, sensing that his words carried meaning beyond their surface content. What kind of networks? Joseph finished his coffee and carefully screwed the cap back onto his thermos before answering. In my community, we have traditions about taking care of each other. Not everyone has to be blood family to be considered family. Sometimes people need temporary kinship, temporary belonging, until they can find their footing again. The concept of temporary kinship intrigued Sarah. Her own family had been small, just her mother and herself, with distant relatives she'd lost touch with years earlier. The idea that family could be something chosen rather than inherited, something that could expand to include people based on need rather than genetics, felt both foreign and appealing. I don't want to impose on strangers, she said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized them as the kind of pride that might be more harmful than helpful in her current situation. Everyone's a stranger until they're not, Joseph replied. And sometimes the people who understand your situation best are the ones who've walked similar paths. He stood up slowly, his movements careful in the way that suggested old injuries or arthritis. There's a community dinner tomorrow evening at the Friendship Center on Pine Street, he said. 7 o'clock. People from the neighborhood, some native families, others who found their way into our circle for various reasons. Good food, good company. You be welcome. The invitation felt significant in a way that Sarah couldn't immediately articulate. It wasn't charity in the conventional sense, not an offer of help that came with conditions or expectations of gratitude. Instead, it seemed to be an offer of inclusion, an invitation to become part of something rather than simply to receive assistance. I don't know much about Native American culture, she said hesitantly, worried about cultural boundaries she might inadvertently cross. Joseph smiled for the first time since they'd been talking, a gentle expression that transformed his weathered features. Culture isn't something you have to know in advance, he said. It's something you learn by being present, by participating with respect and attention. The families who come to dinner represent several different tribes, plus people like yourself who found their way to us. What matters is willingness to be part of community. After Joseph left, promising to look for her the following evening at the Friendship Center, Sarah remained on the church steps thinking about their conversation. The rain had stopped completely, though the air remained cold and damp. For the first time in days, she felt something that might have been hope beginning to form in her chest. The concept of chosen family resonated with experiences from her nursing career, when she'd witnessed patients and their loved ones creating bonds that transcended biological relationships. She'd seen friends who became closer than siblings, neighbors who stepped in when relatives were absent, colleagues who provided support that lasted long beyond professional obligations. But she'd never considered that such bonds might be available to her in her current circumstances. Father Martinez appeared as she was preparing for what she hoped might be her last night on the church steps. He carried his usual offerings of food and coffee, but also a small battery-powered radio and a blanket that looked hand-knitted rather than mass-produced. Mrs. Chun from the congregation made this, he said, unfolding the blanket to reveal intricate patterns worked in warm blues and greens. She asked me to tell you that it was made with prayers for your well-being. The blanket was soft and substantial, clearly the product of many hours of careful work. Sarah accepted it with a gratitude that felt almost overwhelming. The idea that someone she'd never met had spent time creating something specifically for her comfort challenged her growing sense of isolation and invisibility. Father Martinez, she said as they settled into their usual positions on the steps. Do you know about the Friendship Center on Pine Street? The priest's face brightened with recognition. Ah, yes. Joseph Crow, Feathers Community. They do beautiful work in the neighborhood. Many of our parishioners have participated in their dinners and cultural events over the years. Joseph invited me to come tomorrow evening, Sarah said. But I'm nervous about not understanding the protocols, not belonging in that space. Father Martinez was quiet for a moment, watching a group of teenagers walk past on their way home from after-school activities. In my experience, he said thoughtfully, the most authentic communities are those that make room for people who don't yet know where they belong. They understand that belonging is something that develops over time, through presence and participation rather than qualification. His words echoed what Joseph had said about culture being learned through presence rather than advanced knowledge. The idea that belonging could be earned through participation rather than granted based on credentials or background felt both challenging and liberating to Sarah. It suggested that her current circumstances, rather than disqualifying her from community, might actually prepare her to appreciate and contribute to it in ways she hadn't previously considered. The Cherokee have a concept, Father Martinez continued, about the circle always being open for one more. It's not about charity or temporary assistance, but about recognition that everyone has gifts to offer, even when those gifts aren't immediately apparent. That evening, wrapped in Mrs. Chen's blanket and sheltered in the sleeping bag that had been anonymously provided, Sarah felt more hopeful than she had since her mother's death. The cold was still present, the uncertainty about her future still real, but she no longer felt entirely alone with these challenges. She thought about Joseph's invitation and Father Martinez's words about communities that made room for people who didn't yet know where they belonged. The concept suggested that belonging might be less about fitting into existing structures and more about finding places where her own experiences and perspectives could contribute to something larger than herself. The night sounds of the city had become familiar companions over her 4 days on the church steps, but they no longer felt as lonely as they once had. The distant traffic, the occasional footsteps of late commuters, even the wind moving through the trees lining the street. All of these seemed to suggest a rhythm of life continuing around her, life that might once again include her as an active participant rather than simply an observer. As she drifted toward sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about rivers changing course, about water finding new channels after spring floods. The metaphor Joseph had used to describe sudden change began to feel less like description of disaster and more like acknowledgement of natural process. Perhaps her current circumstances weren't simply about loss and displacement, but about the possibility of finding entirely new directions for her life. The temperature dropped further during the night, but Sarah slept more soundly than she had since arriving at the church steps. Mrs. Chin's blanket combined with the sleeping bag to create a warm cocoon that protected her from the cold, while Joseph's invitation and Father Martinez's encouragement had provided protection against the isolation that had been even more challenging to endure than the physical discomfort. She dreamed of warm kitchens filled with voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood, of tables set for more people than seemed possible, of hands passing food and stories in equal measure. When she woke to the gray light of early morning, the dream lingered with enough clarity that she wondered if it might be prediction rather than simple wishful thinking. Father Martinez arrived with coffee and breakfast as usual, but also with news that the weather forecast called for clearing skies and warmer temperatures over the next several days. The immediate crisis of surviving another night in the rain had passed, but Sarah's attention was focused on the evening ahead and the possibility of finding connections that might offer something more substantial than temporary shelter from a storm. Sarah spent the day of the community dinner alternating between anticipation and anxiety. She'd washed her face and hands in the restroom of the public library and done her best to make herself presentable, though her limited wardrobe and lack of access to laundry facilities meant her options were constrained. The clothes she'd been wearing for days carried the subtle but persistent odors of life lived outdoors, and she worried about making a poor impression on people who were extending kindness to a stranger. The Friendship Center turned out to be a converted house in a residential neighborhood 6 blocks from the church, identifiable only by a small hand-painted sign near the front door and the warm light spilling from its windows onto the early evening street. Sarah approached slowly, listening to the sound of voices and laughter coming from inside, trying to gather courage to knock on the door. Through the large front window, she could see people moving around what appeared to be a combined kitchen and dining area. The space looked informal and welcoming, with mismatched chairs arranged around several tables and decorations that seemed to reflect multiple cultural traditions. Children ran between the adults, and everyone appeared to be involved in either food preparation or animated conversation. Sarah was still standing on the sidewalk, working up the nerve to approach the front door, when Joseph appeared from around the side of the building, carrying what looked like a large pot of soup. He spotted her immediately and smiled with the same gentle warmth she'd experienced during their conversation on the church steps. "Sarah," he called, setting down the pot momentarily and walking toward where she stood. "I'm glad you decided to come. Was hoping you would." His welcome felt genuine rather than polite, as if her presence added something to the evening rather than simply requiring accommodation. The distinction felt important to Sarah, who'd grown accustomed to being seen as someone who needed help rather than someone who might have anything to offer. "I wasn't sure about the appropriate time to arrive," she said, falling in a step beside Joseph as he picked up his pot and headed toward the front door. "I didn't want to interrupt preparations or come too early." "No such thing as too early when there's cooking to be done," Joseph replied, holding the door open for her with his free hand. Community dinners work because everyone contributes something, even if it's just presence and appetite. The interior of the Friendship Center was even more welcoming than it had appeared from outside. The main floor had been opened into a single large space that accommodated both cooking and dining, with a stone fireplace providing warmth and ambience. The walls were decorated with artwork that reflected Native American traditions alongside pieces that seemed to represent other cultural backgrounds, creating a visual testimony to the diverse community that gathered there. The kitchen area buzzed with activity as people of various ages worked together to prepare what appeared to be a feast. Sarah noticed immediately that the group included not only Native American families, but also people who seemed to represent different ethnic backgrounds and economic circumstances. An elderly Latina woman was teaching a teenage boy how to fold dumplings, while a young Native American woman worked alongside a white woman with graying hair to prepare what smelled like traditional fry bread. Everyone, "I'd like you to meet Sarah," Joseph announced, leading her into the kitchen area. "Sarah's been staying near St. Mary's this week, and I thought she might enjoy joining us for dinner and company." The introductions that followed felt natural and unhurried. People looked up from their cooking tasks to smile and wave, offering brief welcomes before returning to their work. Sarah was struck by how easily she was included in the flow of activity, handed a dish towel by an older Native American man named Robert, and directed toward a sink full of vegetables that needed washing. As she worked alongside others in the kitchen, Sarah began to understand what Joseph had meant about culture being learned through presence and participation. The preparation of food became a kind of informal education about traditions and techniques, with different people sharing knowledge about ingredients and cooking methods that reflected their various backgrounds. Maria, the elderly Latina woman, explained the significance of the masa she was using to make tamales, while Robert demonstrated the proper technique for frying bread in oil that had been heated to exactly the right temperature. A young woman named Jennifer, who identified herself as Cherokee, shared information about the medicinal properties of the herbs being added to a large pot of vegetable soup. What surprised Sarah most was how naturally the conversation flowed between discussion of cooking techniques and more personal topics. People asked about her background and circumstances without making her feel interrogated, and they shared their own stories with an openness that suggested these dinners regularly served as opportunities for deeper connection. She learned that Robert had retired from construction work after an injury that had left him with chronic pain, and that he found his way to the Friendship Center during a period when he'd struggled with depression and social isolation. Maria had moved to the neighborhood after her husband's death, seeking community among people who understood the challenges of rebuilding life after significant loss. Jennifer was a college student studying social work, but she'd grown up in foster care and understood firsthand the experience of navigating systems that were supposed to help but often fell short of meeting actual needs. Her presence at the dinners was motivated both by cultural connection and by her commitment to creating spaces where people could find support outside formal institutions. "The beauty of these dinners," she explained to Sarah while they worked together to set tables, "is that everyone brings their whole selves, including their struggles and their wisdom. Nobody has to pretend their life is perfect or hide the things they're dealing with." As the evening progressed, and people began gathering around the tables to share the meal they prepared together, Sarah found herself seated between Joseph and an elderly Cherokee woman named Eleanor, who spoke with the authority of someone who'd lived through significant historical changes. The conversation around the table moved fluidly between English and what Sarah assumed were various native languages, with translation provided naturally by whoever was sitting nearest to someone who needed it. Eleanor had worked for decades as a teacher on reservations throughout the Southwest, and her stories about education, cultural preservation, and community resilience provided context for understanding the significance of gatherings like the one Sarah was experiencing. She spoke about the importance of spaces where people could maintain connections to tradition while also adapting to contemporary circumstances. "Community isn't just about sharing food," Eleanor explained, passing a bowl of soup to Sarah. "It's about creating relationships that can sustain people through difficult times. We learn how to take care of each other by practicing it regularly, not just when there's a crisis." The meal itself was a reflection of the diverse backgrounds of the people who'd prepared it. Traditional Native American dishes were served alongside foods that reflected Mexican, African American, and European influences, creating a spread that testified to the multiple cultural streams that had contributed to the neighborhood's identity over time. Sarah found herself eating more than she had in days, partly because the food was delicious and abundant, but also because the atmosphere made eating feel like celebration rather than simply meeting basic needs. She'd forgotten how much the act of sharing a meal could contribute to a sense of well-being beyond the nutritional value of the food itself. After dinner, while some people worked together to clean dishes and put away leftovers, others gathered around the fireplace for what appeared to be a more informal continuation of the evening. Joseph had produced a guitar from somewhere, and several people took turns leading songs that ranged from traditional Native American chants to contemporary folk music that everyone seemed to know. Sarah found herself thinking about the concept of chosen family that Joseph had mentioned during their conversation on the church steps. Watching the easy intimacy between people who clearly cared about each other's well-being, she began to understand that family could be something created through intention and commitment rather than simply inherited through biology. When Eleanor invited her to sit closer to the fire and share her story with the group, Sarah felt nervous but also ready to trust the process that had brought her to this point. She talked about her work as a nurse, her mother's illness and death, the financial crisis that had led to homelessness, and her fears about an uncertain future. The group listened to her story with the same quality of attention she'd received from Joseph, creating space for her words without rushing to offer advice or minimizing her experience. When she finished speaking, several people shared their own stories about times when they'd faced similar challenges, creating a web of connection based on mutual understanding rather than simple sympathy. Robert talked about the period after his injury, when he'd felt cut off from his identity as someone who worked with his hands, and how he'd found new purpose in cooking for community dinners and teaching traditional skills to younger people. Maria shared her experience of rebuilding social connections after decades of marriage had left her uncertain about how to create relationships as a single woman. Jennifer spoke about aging out of the foster care system and the challenge of creating stability without family support, and how she'd learned that chosen family could be more reliable than biological relationships. Her words resonated particularly strongly with Sarah, who'd spent recent years caring for her mother without support from extended family who'd drifted away over time. The thing about chosen family, Jennifer said, looking directly at Sarah, is that it's based on commitment rather than obligation. People choose to be present for each other because they value the relationship, not because they have to. As the evening continued, Sarah began to feel a sense of belonging that she hadn't experienced since before her mother's illness. The combination of being useful in the kitchen, having her story heard with respect, and witnessing the easy care that group members showed for each other created an environment where she could imagine being more than just a recipient of temporary kindness. When Eleanor asked if she'd be interested in helping with food preparation for the following week's dinner, Sarah felt a rush of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. The invitation suggested that her presence added value to the group rather than simply creating additional burden, and it offered the possibility of ongoing connection rather than just temporary assistance. "I'd like that very much," she replied, surprised by how readily the words came. "I'm not sure where I'll be living next week, but I can commit to being here to help with dinner." "Living situations change," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "Commitment to community can be more stable than housing. We've all learned to work around the practical challenges in order to maintain the relationships that matter." As the evening wound down and people began preparing to leave, Sarah realized that she'd spent several hours without thinking about her immediate circumstances or worrying about where she would sleep that night. The experience of being part of a group focused on collective well-being had provided a kind of mental respite that she hadn't known she needed. Joseph offered to walk her back to the church, and they made their way through the quiet neighborhood streets under a sky that had cleared to reveal stars obscured by city light pollution, but still visible to those who knew how to look. The air was cold but crisp rather than damp, and Sarah felt more optimistic about spending another night outdoors than she had since arriving at the church steps. "Thank you," she said as they approached St. Mary's. "Tonight felt like the first time in weeks that I remembered who I am beyond my circumstances." Joseph nodded slowly. "Circumstances change," he said, echoing Eleanor's earlier words. "Character doesn't. Tonight you showed up with generosity and openness, contributed to the work that needed doing, listened to others' stories with respect. Those are the qualities that make someone valuable to community, regardless of where they're sleeping." As Sarah settled into her sleeping bag on the church steps, wrapped in Mrs. Chen's hand-knitted blanket, and surrounded by the sleeping bag that had been anonymously provided, she felt warmer than she had since becoming homeless. The physical temperature hadn't changed, but her sense of connection to the people around her had been transformed by the evening's experience. For the first time since her mother's death, she fell asleep without worrying about the future, instead thinking about the task she'd committed to helping with at the following week's dinner and the stories she'd heard about resilience and renewal. The concept of chosen family had moved from abstract idea to live possibility, offering hope that her current displacement might be temporary while her connections to community could be lasting. The night was quiet and cold, but Sarah slept deeply, dreaming of kitchens full of voices and tables set for more people than seemed possible. Dreams that now felt less like wishful thinking and more like memories of something real she'd experienced and could experience again. The morning after the community dinner brought news that would change everything. Father Martinez arrived at the church steps earlier than usual, carrying not just his customary coffee and breakfast, but also a letter that had been delivered to the church office the previous evening. The envelope was addressed to Sarah in careful handwriting, though she couldn't imagine who might have known to reach her through the church. "This came yesterday after you'd left for the dinner," Father Martinez explained, handing her the envelope along with the steaming cup of coffee. "The woman who delivered it said you'd understand what it meant." Sarah opened the letter with careful fingers, still cold from the night air. Inside was a handwritten note from Eleanor, the Cherokee elder she'd met at the Friendship Center, along with a set of keys and an address she recognized as being several blocks away in the same neighborhood. "Dear Sarah," the letter began in Eleanor's precise script, "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and the question of temporary kinship. I have a small apartment above my garage that I've been using for storage, but it has heat and running water and could serve as living space for someone who needs it temporarily. If you're interested, the keys are enclosed. Consider it part of our community's commitment to taking care of each other. There are no conditions except that you continue to be yourself, someone willing to contribute to the well-being of others." Sarah read the letter twice before the full meaning penetrated her disbelief. Eleanor was offering her housing, not as charity, but as an extension of the community connections that had begun developing the night before. The distinction felt crucial, transforming what could have been a rescue into an invitation to participate in a relationship based on mutual care and contribution. "Good news?" Father Martinez asked, noting the expression of wonder spreading across Sarah's face. "I think so," Sarah replied, though she was still processing the implications of Eleanor's offer. "One of the people I met last night has offered me a place to stay. I'm not sure I understand why, or what she expects in return." Father Martinez smiled, settling beside her on the steps with the familiarity of their shared morning routine. "In my experience, the most generous gifts are often the ones that come without complicated conditions. Sometimes people offer help simply because they have the capacity to do so, and they recognize need in someone they've come to care about." The concept of being cared about by someone she'd just met felt almost foreign to Sarah after weeks of increasing isolation. Her relationships had become casualties of her circumstances, as friends and colleagues had gradually withdrawn when her situation became too persistent and complicated for casual sympathy to address. The idea that new connections could develop quickly based on recognition of shared values, rather than long history, seemed almost too hopeful to believe. She spent the morning completing her usual routine at the library, using their computers to continue searching for employment opportunities, though her focus kept drifting to Eleanor's letter and the keys that represented possibility she'd almost given up hoping for. The prospect of having private space, of being able to shower regularly, and wash clothes felt almost overwhelming in its significance. But beyond the practical benefits, Eleanor's offer represented something even more important: recognition that Sarah had something to contribute to the community beyond just being a recipient of help. The letter had specifically mentioned her willingness to contribute to others' well-being, suggesting that her value to the group was already apparent despite her current circumstances. Around noon, Sarah decided to walk to the address Eleanor had provided, curious to see the space that might become her temporary home. The route took her through a residential area she'd passed through before, but never explored carefully, a neighborhood of modest houses with well-maintained yards and signs of long-term community investment. Eleanor's house was a small craftsman-style home with a separate garage that had been converted to include a second story. The apartment entrance was accessed by exterior stairs that led to a small landing with a door that looked recently painted. Sarah climbed the steps slowly, using Eleanor's keys to open the door and step inside what might become her sanctuary. The space was compact but thoughtfully arranged, with a main room that combined living and sleeping areas, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom with a shower that looked newly installed. Windows on two walls provided natural light and views of the neighborhood, while a small electric heater promised warmth that had been missing from her life for the past week. What struck Sarah most about the space was its readiness for habitation. The furniture was simple but comfortable. The kitchenette was stocked with basic supplies and towels, and bedding had been neatly arranged on shelves as if someone had prepared for her arrival. The care evident in these preparations suggested that Eleanor's offer had been planned rather than impulsive, the result of consideration rather than momentary sympathy. A note taped to the refrigerator provided additional information. The utilities were included, the address for mail delivery, and Eleanor's invitation to join her for coffee the following morning to discuss any questions or concerns. The practical details were handled with the same thoughtfulness evident in the space itself, creating an environment where Sarah could focus on rebuilding her life rather than managing daily survival. That afternoon, Sarah returned to the church steps to collect her few belongings and thank Father Martinez for his consistent kindness during her time there. The priest received news of her housing opportunity with genuine pleasure, though he also made it clear that she would continue to be welcome on the church steps if circumstances changed. Community takes many forms, he said, helping her fold the sleeping bag and blanket that had sustained her through cold nights. Sometimes it's about providing emergency shelter, and sometimes it's about creating space for people to rebuild their lives. Both are expressions of the same fundamental commitment to caring for each other. Moving into Eleanor's apartment felt surreal after days of living outdoors. The simple act of turning a key in her own lock, of having privacy and safety and warmth, brought Sarah to tears that surprised her with their intensity. She'd been functioning in survival mode for so long that she'd forgotten how much energy had been devoted to managing basic needs rather than pursuing longer-term goals. Her first priority was a long, hot shower, an experience that felt almost sacramental after days of washing in public restrooms. Standing under the steady stream of warm water, Sarah allowed herself to fully experience the relief of being clean and warm and safe, luxuries she'd taken for granted before they'd been stripped away. That evening, she prepared a simple meal in her small kitchen, marveling at the ability to cook for herself and eat at her own table. The apartment's windows looked out over Eleanor's backyard, where lights from neighboring houses created a sense of being part of a community rather than isolated from it. As promised, Eleanor appeared the following morning with coffee and homemade bread, settling comfortably at Sarah's small table, as if they'd been sharing breakfast for years rather than days. She asked practical questions about Sarah's needs and comfort level, but also began sharing more about the community that had welcomed Sarah so readily. The Friendship Center dinners grew out of recognition that traditional support systems don't work for everyone. Eleanor explained, breaking bread with the kind of deliberate attention that made simple gestures feel ceremonial. Some people fall through the cracks of official programs. Others need community that's based on choice rather than geography or blood relationship. Eleanor's own story emerged gradually during their conversation. She'd retired from teaching on reservations throughout the Southwest, but had moved to the city to be closer to grandchildren whose relationship with their Cherokee heritage had been interrupted by urban life and cultural assimilation. Her work with the Friendship Center was motivated by commitment to maintaining indigenous values of community care while adapting those values to contemporary urban circumstances. Indigenous communities have always understood that everyone has gifts, even people who are currently struggling, Eleanor said. Your background as a nurse, your experience caring for your mother, your willingness to show up and contribute even when you're dealing with your own challenges. These are exactly the qualities that strengthen community. The conversation helped Sarah understand that her acceptance into the group hadn't been based on pity or charitable obligation, but on recognition of her potential contributions to collective well-being. The distinction felt crucial for maintaining her sense of dignity while accepting help that she desperately needed. Over the following days, Sarah established routines that balanced job searching with participation in the community activities that were becoming increasingly central to her sense of identity. She continued helping with food preparation for the weekly dinners, but also began volunteering at a community clinic where her nursing background made her valuable despite her current unemployment. The clinic work was volunteer rather than paid, but it provided structure for her days and reminded her of skills and knowledge that retained value regardless of her housing status. Working with patients who faced many of the same systemic challenges she'd experienced helped her understand how individual struggles were connected to broader patterns of economic inequality and inadequate social support. Dr. Reyes, who managed the clinic, was a young Latina physician who'd grown up in the neighborhood and returned after medical school to serve her own community. She welcomed Sarah's assistance with the enthusiasm of someone who understood how difficult it was to find experienced medical professionals willing to work in underserved areas. Your timing is perfect, Dr. Reyes said during Sarah's first week of volunteering. We're expanding our hours to provide evening clinics for people who can't take time off work during the day. Having someone with your background would make it possible to serve a lot more families. The volunteer position led to conversations about potential paid employment as the clinic secured additional funding, though Dr. Reyes was careful not to make promises about timing or salary. Still, the possibility of returning to nursing work in a setting that aligned with her growing understanding of community care felt like a kind of homecoming Sarah hadn't expected. Her integration into the Friendship Center community deepened as she took on additional responsibilities beyond food preparation. Jennifer, the social work student, invited her to help with a support group for women dealing with housing instability, while Robert asked her to assist with a program teaching traditional Cherokee crafts to neighborhood children. The beautiful thing about this community, Jennifer explained as they planned activities for the support group, is that people move fluidly between giving and receiving help. Someone who needs support in one area often has expertise to share in another area. Sarah's nursing background made her particularly valuable in the support group, where her medical knowledge combined with her recent experience of homelessness created credibility that purely professional credentials couldn't provide. Women who might have been suspicious of advice from social service professionals trusted her insights because she'd walked similar paths. Working with Robert on the Children's Crafts program introduced Sarah to Cherokee artistic traditions while also teaching her about the importance of cultural transmission in maintaining community identity. The children who participated came from various backgrounds, but they all seemed hungry for connection to traditions that provided alternatives to the individualistic values that dominated mainstream culture. When children learn to make something beautiful with their hands, Robert explained while demonstrating beadwork techniques, they also learn that they have the power to create rather than just consume. That's a political lesson as much as an artistic one. 3 weeks after moving into Eleanor's apartment, Sarah received word that the community clinic had secured a grant that would allow them to hire her as a part-time nurse practitioner. The salary wouldn't be sufficient to afford market-rate housing in the neighborhood, but combined with her volunteer work and community connections, it provided the foundation for long-term stability. More importantly, the job represented work that felt meaningful in ways her previous hospital position hadn't. Instead of functioning within a medical system focused primarily on individual treatment, she'd be part of an approach that understood health as connected to housing, nutrition, community support, and economic security. Eleanor celebrated the job news by cooking a special dinner that brought together many of the people Sarah had come to consider family over the past month. The gathering felt different from her first community dinner because she now understood the relationships and histories that connected the group members to each other and to her. "This is what community looks like," Eleanor said, raising a glass of homemade elderberry wine and toast. People supporting each other through difficult transitions, celebrating successes together, creating networks of care that can sustain everyone through whatever challenges arise. Looking around the table at faces that had become familiar and dear, Sarah realized that her experience of displacement had led to discoveries about community and belonging that might not have been possible if her life had continued on its previous trajectory. The loss of her conventional stability had created space for understanding forms of security based on relationships rather than just individual achievement. That night, settling into bed in her small but comfortable apartment, Sarah reflected on the journey from church steps to chosen family. The transformation hadn't been linear or simple, but it had revealed possibilities for connection and contribution that challenged everything she'd previously understood about how communities form and sustain themselves. The Cherokee concept that Eleanor had mentioned about the circle always being open for one more had become lived reality rather than abstract philosophy. Sarah had found her place in that circle not by proving her worthiness or overcoming her struggles, but by showing up consistently and contributing whatever she could offer at each stage of her integration into the community. As she drifted toward sleep, Sarah thought about the quiet wisdom Joseph had shared during their first real conversation, about rivers changing course after spring floods and water finding new channels. Her life had indeed found new channels, flowing toward connections and commitments she couldn't have imagined when she'd first settled onto the church steps with nothing but her circumstances and her willingness to continue forward despite uncertainty. The future remained uncertain in many ways, but it was no longer frightening in the way it had been when she'd faced it alone. Whatever challenges arose, she now had community to help address them, and, equally importantly, she had people who depended on her contributions to their collective well-being. The circle that had opened to include her had also been strengthened by her presence, creating the kind of mutual benefit that sustainable communities required. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the Friendship Center preparing food for what had become the largest community dinner in the organization's history. The monthly gatherings had grown from the intimate group she'd first encountered to events that regularly drew 50 or more people from throughout the neighborhood and beyond. The expansion reflected both the community's reputation for inclusivity and the increasing need for spaces where people could find connection and support outside conventional institutions. Her role in the community had evolved as naturally as her initial integration had unfolded. In addition to her part-time work at the clinic, Sarah had become the informal coordinator for the Friendship Center's outreach to people experiencing homelessness, a position that combined her nursing background with her lived experience of displacement and her growing understanding of indigenous approaches to community care. The outreach program operated on principles that challenge conventional social service models. Instead of requiring people to meet eligibility criteria or navigate complex bureaucracies, the program focused on relationship building and meeting people where they were literally and figuratively. Sarah and a team of volunteers would visit encampments and areas where homeless individuals gathered, offering food, basic medical care, and, most importantly, consistent presence and connection. The healing happens through relationship. Eleanor had explained when they first discussed formalizing Sarah's outreach work. People need to be seen and valued before they can begin addressing the practical challenges they're facing. This philosophy had proven effective in ways that surprised even Sarah, who'd experienced firsthand the isolation that homelessness created. Over the months, dozens of people had found their way from street situations to various forms of stable housing and community connection, not through case management or program requirements, but through the gradual development of trust and belonging. Maria, the elderly Latina woman who'd taught Sarah about masa preparation during her first community dinner, had become a key partner in the outreach efforts. Her own experience of rebuilding community after loss made her particularly effective at reaching women who'd become isolated by circumstances beyond their control. Together, they developed what they called Abuela networks, informal support systems based on the understanding that everyone needed surrogate family members who could provide guidance and practical assistance. When people have lost their biological families to death or distance or conflict, Maria explained to new volunteers, they still need elders who can offer wisdom and younger people who can learn from their experiences. Community means creating those relationships intentionally. The success of these approaches had attracted attention from social service organizations throughout the city, and Sarah found herself increasingly called upon to speak at conferences and training sessions about alternatives to traditional homelessness programs. The invitations felt surreal to someone who'd been sleeping on church steps less than a year earlier, but they also represented opportunities to influence policies and practices that could benefit other people facing similar challenges. At one particularly memorable conference, Sarah had shared the stage with Eleanor and Joseph to present their community's approach to what they called inclusive kinship. The audience of social workers and program administrators had been initially skeptical of methods that seemed too informal and relationship-based to be replicable, but the documented outcomes spoke for themselves. We're not suggesting that formal programs don't have value, Sarah had explained to the conference participants. But we've learned that the most effective interventions are often the ones that restore people's sense of belonging and contribution, not just their access to services. The presentation had led to site visits from organizations in other cities interested in adapting similar approaches to their local contexts. Each visiting group left with new understanding of how indigenous values of community care could be applied in urban settings, creating alternatives to individualistic models of social service delivery. Dr. Reyes had supported Sarah's growing involvement in policy and training work by providing flexibility in her clinic schedule and encouraging her to pursue additional education that would formalize her expertise in community health approaches. Sarah had enrolled in a graduate program designed for working professionals, studying public health with a focus on community-based interventions. Her graduate coursework provided academic frameworks for understanding what she was learning through practice, while her community work offered real-world testing of theories and methods being discussed in classroom settings. The combination created a kind of praxis that enriched both her intellectual understanding and her practical effectiveness. One of her professors, Dr. Williams, was a Cherokee scholar who'd spent decades documenting indigenous approaches to community wellness and their applications in contemporary settings. Her work provided historical and cultural context for the methods Sarah was helping to develop, connecting their local efforts to larger movements toward decolonizing social services and community development. What you're describing in your fieldwork, Dr. Williams had told Sarah during a conference about her research, represents a return to understanding that preceded the individualistic models that dominate mainstream social services. Indigenous communities have always known that healing happens through restoring people's connections to community and purpose. The academic validation felt important, not because Sarah doubted the effectiveness of their methods, but because it provided language and frameworks that could help communicate their approach to audiences who might be skeptical of practices that seem too simple or informal to be effective. Meanwhile, Sarah's personal life had stabilized in ways that sometimes still surprised her. She'd been able to move from Eleanor's garage apartment into a small house that she rented with Jennifer, the social work student who'd become one of her closest friends. The shared living arrangement allowed both women to afford housing in the neighborhood where their community work was centered, while also providing the kind of chosen family relationship that had become central to both their lives. Their house had become an unofficial extension of the Friendship Center, a place where people could stop by for conversation, advice, or simply the comfort of being somewhere they were welcome. The kitchen table where Sarah and Jennifer shared meals had also hosted countless informal counseling sessions, planning meetings for community events, and celebrations of milestones in various people's journeys toward stability. Our house has become a healing space without us really planning it that way, Jennifer observed one evening as they prepared dinner, while two women from the community support group helped and shared updates about their own housing situations. It's like the energy of care and welcome just creates itself once you commit to maintaining it. The observation reflected something Sarah had learned about the nature of community building. It required consistent intention and attention, but it also had a generative quality that created more resources and connections than any individual effort could produce. Their small acts of hospitality and care had rippled outward, creating networks of mutual support that extended far beyond what they could have accomplished working independently. Robert had become like a grandfather to Sarah, teaching her traditional Cherokee crafts and sharing stories about the historical experiences that had shaped his understanding of resilience and community survival. His guidance had been particularly important as Sarah navigated the challenge of honoring indigenous wisdom while avoiding cultural appropriation, learning to participate in Cherokee community life as an invited guest rather than someone attempting to claim identity that wasn't hers. Community membership is about relationship and commitment, not blood quantum or tribal enrollment. He'd explained when Sarah had expressed concerns about her role in culturally specific programming. You've proven your commitment to our values through your actions. That makes you family in the ways that matter most. The acceptance Robert described had been demonstrated practically when the Friendship Center decided to apply for federal funding that would allow them to expand their programs significantly. Sarah had been asked to serve as the project director, a role that would involve managing substantial resources and staff while maintaining the community-based approaches that had made their work effective. The position represented both opportunity and responsibility that sometimes felt overwhelming. Sarah would be managing a budget larger than her previous nursing salary, supervising staff members, and representing the community to funders and government officials who might not understand the philosophical foundations of their work. Leadership in our community means serving the collective vision rather than advancing personal ambitions. Eleanor had reminded her during their conversations about whether to accept the position. The question isn't whether you feel qualified, but whether you're committed to maintaining the values and relationships that have made this work possible. Sarah's decision to accept the role had been influenced by recognition that her background and experience made her particularly suited to bridge between indigenous community values and mainstream institutional requirements. Her nursing training had prepared her for managing complex systems, while her experience of homelessness provided credibility with the populations they served, and her graduate education was developing skills in program evaluation and policy analysis. The evening of the expanded community dinner that marked the official launch of their federally funded programming felt like a celebration of everything the community had accomplished together. The Friendship Center's main room had been transformed for the occasion, with tables arranged to accommodate the largest group they'd ever hosted while maintaining the intimate atmosphere that made people feel welcomed rather than overwhelmed. Sarah looked around the room as people arrived, recognizing faces from various stages of her own journey and the community's development. Father Martinez was there with several members of his congregation, including Mrs. Chun, who'd knitted the blanket that had sustained Sarah through cold nights on the church steps. Dr. Reyes had brought colleagues from the clinic, while several professors from Sarah's graduate program had come to see the practical applications of theories they discussed in classroom settings. But most meaningful to Sarah were the people whose stories had become intertwined with her own through their shared commitment to creating community based on mutual care rather than individual achievement. Joseph sat at a table with several men who'd found their way from street homelessness to stable housing through the outreach program, all of them now volunteers who helped others navigate similar transitions. Jennifer was facilitating a table where teenagers from the neighborhood shared space with elderly community members, creating intergenerational connections that provided mentorship and friendship across age barriers. Maria moved between tables with the authority of someone who'd become a beloved matriarch, checking on everyone's comfort and facilitating introductions between people who shared common interests or experiences. Eleanor, now approaching 80, but still energetic in her commitment to community building, offered a blessing that acknowledged the various spiritual traditions represented in the room while invoking shared values of care, respect, and mutual responsibility. Her words created a moment of collective intention that connected individual presence to larger purposes. "We gather tonight not just to share food," she said, "but to celebrate the understanding that we are responsible for each other's well-being, that our individual healing is connected to collective healing, that community is something we create together through our choices about how to treat each other." During dinner, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her from church steps to community leadership, from isolation to chosen family, from survival mode to contributing to others' well-being. The transformation hadn't been linear or simple, but it had revealed possibilities for connection and contribution that challenged everything she'd previously understood about how communities form and sustain themselves. The dinner concluded with people sharing stories about what community meant to them and their hopes for the expanded programming that would serve even more people in the coming year. The storytelling tradition had become a regular feature of community dinners, creating opportunities for people to reflect on their experiences and contribute to collective understanding of what made their approaches effective. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she found herself thinking about the Cherokee concept Eleanor had taught her about the circle always being open for one more, and how that philosophy had become the foundation for everything they'd built together. "A year ago, I was sleeping on church steps, believing that I'd lost everything that connected me to community and purpose," she said, looking around the room at faces that had become family. "What I learned here is that community isn't something you lose when circumstances change. It's something you create through choosing to show up for each other again and again, regardless of what else is happening in your life." She paused, feeling the truth of her words settle into understanding that was both personal and political. The programs we're launching aren't just about providing services to people who need them. They're about creating spaces where everyone can contribute to collective well-being, where giving and receiving happen in the same relationships, where people are valued for who they are rather than what they can produce. As the evening concluded and people began clearing tables and washing dishes with the same collective energy that had prepared the meal, Sarah felt grateful for the journey that had led to this moment. The community she'd found through displacement and loss had taught her that belonging wasn't something that could be taken away by economic circumstances or institutional failures, but something that could be created through consistent commitment to caring for each other. Walking home with Jennifer through the neighborhood that had become the geography of her chosen family, Sarah reflected on how her understanding of home had been transformed. Home was no longer just the place where she slept, but the network of relationships and commitments that provided meaning and stability regardless of her physical address. The Cherokee elder who told her she was one of us had been offering more than temporary assistance. He'd been inviting her into a way of understanding community that could sustain people through whatever challenges life presented. That invitation had become the foundation for rebuilding not just her individual life, but her understanding of what human beings could create together when they committed to treating each other as family. As they reached their front door, Sarah looked back toward the Friendship Center where lights were still on as the last volunteers finished cleaning up from the evening celebration. The building had become more than just a meeting space. It was a physical manifestation of the community's commitment to creating alternatives to systems that treated people as problems to be solved rather than as human beings with gifts to offer. The work would continue tomorrow and in all the days to follow, but tonight Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that she'd found her place in the circle that was always open for one more, and that her presence there had helped make room for countless others who would follow similar journeys from displacement to belonging, from isolation to chosen family, from surviving to thriving in community built on the understanding that everyone has something essential to contribute to the healing of the world.